Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about the hubris of evolutionary biologists and scientists concerning evolution, concerning natural selection, and I'm going to talk about intelligent design. And, intelligent design is wrong, but in terms of just the big picture, intelligent design, totally wrong-headed. But the way that the average scientist reacts to intelligent design arguments also totally wrong. And here's why. A lot of the folks who are evolutionary biologists and scientists will respond to intelligent design arguments. Intelligent design arguments, to summarize what I take them to be, are arguments that natural selection isn't, in fact, enough to explain the diversity of life that we have on Earth, or how we got the diversity that we have in the time that was available. Something along those lines might be one way to phrase it. And intelligent design folks will put forth a whole lots of arguments about how it's not possible to get this much complexity in that much period of time, and so therefore you need an intelligent designer, intelligent design of some kind, something that goes beyond natural selection. Now, a lot of the arguments that they put forth are very sophisticated arguments, which I'm not going to get into here. There's lots of sophisticated arguments about and skeptical about how we can come to explain getting this diversity of complexity and life and beautiful and designed stuff all around us in the period of time, albeit incredibly long, but still in the time that has been allowed. And some evolutionary biologists, many scientists, have the kind of attitude which is this: oh, we totally understand how natural selection was able to create all of this complexity and diversity and intelligence and design in the period of time allotted for it. And we do not fully understand. This is incredibly complex things for which we don't have a full understanding. Now, this doesn't mean that intelligent design is right. What this just means is that many of the scientists, like me in my field, are overly zealous and pushing back and overly confident. And it's a kind of false confidence, and it's unnecessary. Because to make the argument against intelligent design, you don't need to convince people that you understand fully how it is that natural selection led to the full complexity and diversity of life in the period of time that's been given to it. Now, let me give you another example. And I did a Science Moment on this 3 or 4 years ago, and it was just like 59 seconds. And that's back when Science Moment was just like it was going to be under a minute. It was going to be a moment. And now these are, they're more like 4 minutes to 15 minutes on average. And it came up again because I've been talking about the human propensity to want to see designers in all facets of politics and in religion and so forth. So let's go to consciousness. And I don't really mean consciousness. Instead of talking about the richness and diversity and complexity of life, let's talk about the richness and diversity and complexity of mental thought. Right? We have these amazingly rich mental lives, including consciousness. I tend to think there's some conceptual misunderstandings with consciousness. So I'd sometimes been avoiding it. Just like to say the immense rich mental complexity and richness of our lives, it's incredibly amazing, right? Now, unlike evolutionary biologists and scientists, where people would want to push back on intelligent designers and say, oh, we totally understand how we get all this complexity in the period of time allotted on the basis of natural selection, no neuroscientist is comfortable to say that we totally understand how it is that all of the rich complexity of mental life comes from our brains, right? So we know a lot, but how much we would need to know to fully understand that, we might be at 0.1%. I mean, just to throw out sort of meaningless numbers, we don't know much in terms of explaining the full richness. It's incredibly complicated, and no neuroscientist would be anywhere near the kind of confidence that evolutionary biologists sometimes when they're pushing back on intelligent science. No, we don't know. But you know what we do know? We know it's the brain that's responsible for the richness of mental life. It's not God that's responsible for it. It's not some other magic, elves over there. It's not a spirit. It's not a something that's floating outside of our brains. It's our brains and nervous systems more generally. It's that our brains are responsible for the richness of mental life. And then you can provide kinds of, like, if you were just to do experiments to try to show that our brains are the generator of our mental lives, That is much easier to provide evidence for, right? Knowing that our brains are responsible for our rich mental lives is a gazillion times easier to know than to know how our brains come to undergird the richness of mental life, right? This is the difference between that our brains are responsible versus how the hell are they responsible to do that, right? We don't fully know that. We barely even know that. But that doesn't confuse us in the case of the richness of mental life and consciousness, because it's clear that they're completely different. But for some reason, I don't have it fully worked out, in the area of evolution and the richness of diversity of life on Earth, people seem to confuse these things. We know there's just the amount of evidence that we have that the richness of life on Earth and complexity of life on Earth and design and so forth comes from natural selection is overwhelming. In the same way that we know that our richness of mental life comes from the brain, not something else, right? But you don't need to go on and show false confidence and say that we know how in either case, right? Knowing how is a gazillion times harder, right? And all we need to push back on intelligent design is to say that we know that natural selection, this mechanism, is responsible. Just like pushing back on like the spirit or something like this being responsible, some kind of inanimate spirit is responsible for our richness of mental life. You say, no, we know that it's the brain. In fact, there's just tremendous whole bodies of hundreds of years of evidence that shows this overwhelmingly. But we still don't know how, right? And there's nothing embarrassing about that. We don't know how we get this rich mental life from our brains. We have some inklings of how, and we're pushing in the right direction. But that's fine. We know that. And the same for evolution. Right? So don't get these two things confused, because the bar for knowing that is here. The bar for knowing how is the heights of the universe. And I don't know how it is. There couldn't be anything more different conceptually, but people nevertheless conflate them all the time when you're arguing about evolution. That was your science moment. For those interested in evolution, and even if you're not, even if you're anti-evolution and you want to know about what God, the emotional expressions that God gave us, if you want to think about it that way, it doesn't really matter in this sense. You want to know why we have the emotional expressions that we do, why we are the emotional creatures that we are as social animals. Go get a copy of Tim Barber, My Expressly Human. It came out last month. If you've already read it, go give us a review at Amazon. We, as freedom-defending scientists who spoke up instead of keeping our heads down during the COVID medical authoritarianism and totalitarianism really that hit us over the last 2.5 years, we stuck our necks out. And now no mainstream journalist will cover us. I was historically in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, covering Scientific American, Discover Magazine, all over the place. Almost none of these places will touch me, because I stood up for freedom when it mattered in our lifetimes. And that was your science moment.